I recently got back from my first big hiking trip for the summer. We spent a week in the Italian Dolomites, or in South Tyrol, and it did not go as planned. This is the third day of rain and hail and storms in a row. And for me, living in Spain for the last 5 years, that entire time has been basically a drought. So I'm a little bit rusty when it comes to looking after my mindset and my gear and looking after myself whilst walking in torrential rain for day after day. I think nature is our greatest teacher, and ultimately I believe if you're really going to learn lessons, you have to go out and learn them yourself in the outdoors. But I think what I'm sharing with you in this video will provide a good basis for you to get started and be safe and comfortable in what is sometimes a tricky environment when you're constantly wet. It's been a while since I've been subjected to this much wet weather, and it's been good actually. It's been a good learning experience. I've learned or relearned a lot about moisture management and warmth management over the last few days. Brought back memories from my days and growing up in Tasmania, dealing with a lot of rain. I think the first and most important thing is the mindset component. Like if you go into a rainy, wet hike thinking it's going to be a terrible experience and it's going to be the worst and you're going to hate it, then you probably will. But if you can switch something in your mind to enjoy the suffering and enjoy the challenge of being a little bit wet and a little bit uncomfortable, you probably have a good time, or at least a much better time. The way I think about it is like the rewards are so much greater after you've been a little bit uncomfortable for a while. Like it's so nice to get warm and dry after you've been wet for a few days and cold for a few days. So the first and the greatest tip I think I have is to embrace the suck. And this is an important lesson for anyone that's going out and spending more time in the wilderness. I think the best advice I can give you if you're having a hard time out in the wilderness is to just stay positive. I think one of the hardest things to wrap your head around is that you can't fight the rain. It's going to be everywhere. You're either going to be stuck in your tent or stuck in a refuge and waiting it out, or you're going to be out battling the elements and trying to stay dry. And whilst the gear tips I'm going to share with you later in the video are valuable, I really think it pales in comparison to the real point of this video, which is just getting your mindset right when you're outside. So when your shoes are soaked and you're cold and you're frustrated by the weather, just keep reminding yourself that you're outside and just be grateful for that. And just ask yourself the question, would you rather be stuck at work, or would you rather be out here in the elements embracing the challenges that Mother Nature is presenting you? I really believe every experience you have outside happens for a reason, and nature is not going to give you anything you're not ready for. But we learn nothing from living in a utopia where everything goes right and nothing challenges you. So if you understand that and see challenges as little tests with which you can grow and become a better person, then it makes difficult situations easier to overcome mentally. Okay, let's move on to something a little bit more practical. And this comes down to where you set up your tent. Now, if you are expecting rain, the way that you set up your tent and the place that you set up your tent is going to be very different than if you weren't expecting rain. Most of the time I'm concerned about wind and the wind rustling the tent. And that's the mistake that I made on the first night when I set up my tent in this huge bowl. Overnight we had a lot of rain, and although I chose my tent location carefully, there was no fighting what was going to happen when the rain came in, and there was basically a deluge overnight which soaked absolutely everything in my tent. And I'm so glad that I had this new Big Agnes mat, which is like this thick. Luckily I was on a bit of an angle, so it was flowing away from me rather than just sitting around in a pool. So I did make a good decision on that part, but ultimately it wasn't a good campsite selection. Benji and I both woke up in the middle of the night with a river running through our tents and all of our gear was soaked. So I guess the lesson here is when you're setting up your tent, have a bit of an assessment of the lay of the land. If you are expecting rain, put some thought into where the water is going to run and try and find a place that is a little bit elevated in which to put your tent so that the water isn't pooling around where you're setting up your camp. I'm on a hill with a little bit of a flat spot, and it drains off this way, and it can drain off this way, meaning that none of the water is going to sit underneath my tent. So I'm hoping everything will drain away, and it's really on a slight elevation compared to everything else. Okay, the second tip is a little bit of an obvious one for those of us who have been doing this for a while. I learnt this lesson a few years ago when I moved away from using a pack cover. In my mind, having a pack cover that only covers like 60% of the pack and leaves your back exposed, then your stuff is probably going to get wet. And now what I use is a NyloFLUME liner within my pack. And I have a clip at the top, and I know if I keep that bag in perfect condition and there's no holes in it, everything within that bag is going to be totally dry. This is one of the NyloFLUME pack liners I have. I got it from Trekking Light store. I'll leave it in the description if you're in Europe and you want to get yourself one of these. But if you're in the US, apparently trash compactor bags are the way to go, as long as they're thick enough to be durable so they don't break within your bag. The next tip is about shoes. And I have a little bit of a different perspective on this. A lot of people will opt for Gore-Tex or any other waterproof protective liner with the aim of keeping your feet dry. But in my experience, when things are really rainy, your feet are going to get wet no matter what. The problem with Gore-Tex is once the water is inside the shoe, it's very difficult for the shoe to get dry. I find in the past where I've walked in torrential rain with a liner like Gore-Tex, that it kind of just keeps the water inside the shoe. So what I opt for now is a really light shoe that can dry quickly, that can push the water out, and I just accept that my feet are going to get wet. So I guess the lesson is, and my advice here is, don't try and fight it. If it is really rainy, just accept that your feet are going to get wet. And then it really comes down to your sock choice, which I always recommend, a wool synthetic blend. Ideally, the Silverlight sock that I use all the time. That is my favorite sock and has been for years. I find that dries really quickly and it keeps my feet warm, even if I am in a really cold environment where I'm constantly wet. When the rain stops, I'm usually able to get my feet at least a little bit dry by the end of the day. My fourth tip is around keeping my body warm. And a lot of the time, I'm obviously wearing a Gore-Tex jacket, which is going to keep some of the rain out at least. The fact is that you're probably going to get wet if it is really torrential rain. So for that reason, I'm always wearing a wool base layer on my top. Wool keeps you warm when it's wet. Same thing with the socks that I mentioned earlier. I want my next to skin base layer to be merino wool. And that way, if I do get wet, if somehow the water gets inside my jacket, which it often does, I'm still going to be warm because I've got that wool base layer on my next to skin. In the summer, I don't wear wool base layers on my bottoms. I bring them to put them on and I keep them warm in my pack so that I can jump into my sleeping bag and be warm and put that layer on for the night. But if I'm hiking in summer and in wet weather, I just accept that my legs are going to be wet. The only caveat to that, I would say, is when it's really windy and wet, I don't want to have my legs exposed to the wind because that's going to sap out a lot of my body temperature. So in that case, I like to just throw on a cheap pair of rain pants, and really they're more about keeping the wind away from me. I'm probably still going to have water flowing down my butt and I'm still going to be a bit wet, but the rain pants or the wind pants will keep the wind off my skin. And that way I'm able to retain a lot of my own body heat and I don't get super cold. The other regions where wool base layers can be really useful to keep you warm even if you are wet is on your head. So I always like to have a merino wool hat and I like to have merino wool gloves most of the time. Like I've mentioned in other videos, I've struggled to find merino wool gloves that enable me to use my phone, but in colder temperatures, I'll always switch to a merino wool glove because I'm going to prioritize keeping my hands warm. That is where you lose a lot of your heat, through your hands and through your head. So for those reasons, I'm a big fan of using merino wool as a next to skin layer on my head, my torso, my hands and my feet. The next tip is about how we can get warm and dry after a long day of walking in the rain. What I like to do is to mentally separate all of the clothing that I have into two categories. And those categories are category A, and this is equipment or clothing that is acceptable and very likely to get wet. So what would be in category A is things like my rain jacket, my rain pants, anything that I'm wearing throughout the day. So my gloves are probably going to get wet. My sun hoodie is probably going to get wet, and my next to skin base layer, which is wool, is almost certainly going to get wet as well. And also have my socks in category A, the same as my shoes. I just accept that this stuff is going to get wet and I wear it throughout the day. The second category of clothing, category B, this is absolutely unacceptable to get wet. So I am doing everything that I possibly can to make sure that rain and moisture isn't collecting on those particular pieces of clothing. So that category would include my warm base layer, my insulated jacket, a base layer for my top, a warm hat that is dry that I can put on my head, and any other extra layer. I usually bring like a light pair of fleece track pants with which to keep me warm, especially in colder months. And I also have a pair of socks in category B that is unacceptable to get wet, because I definitely want to be putting on a warm pair of socks when I get cozy and comfortable in my tent during the night. I know there's people that like to take 3 or 4 pairs of socks on a trip, but I really like to slim that down to just 2. With one I'm happy to get wet, and another one that absolutely does not get wet. So that category A is clothing that is acceptable to get wet. In fact, I know that it's going to get wet. And category B, I want to protect with my life. I never want to allow moisture or rain to get to those warm, dry pieces of clothing that I'm keeping really wrapped up in that NyloFLUME Pack Liner. And I know that when I set up my camp, I'm going to be able to have warm, dry clothes that I can put straight on. So I want to give you guys a little bit of a tour of my tent and how I organize everything. So I have my Q-Core Deluxe, and then my lightweight quilt on top of that. I got my Trekology pillow. Here is a very important piece of gear. This is a big plastic bag, and everything overnight will go in that in case it starts raining, in case I have, water rushing down here into the tent. I'm going to be elevated on this mat. I've got my Tyvek floor, and that will hopefully keep everything dry, but if it doesn't, everything else is going to go in this bag, and that way all my dry clothes and all the important things are going to stay dry. In this corner, this is my wet corner, so anything here that has been banished to this corner is probably going to stay wet unless I choose to do some drying overnight. In this corner over here, I've got some semi-wet stuff that I'll probably put on over the next couple of hours to dry this stuff out, and then hopefully I'll have dry clothes tomorrow, even if it is raining overnight. And here is everything else. Most of this stuff has its own plastic bags. If it doesn't, it's going to go in the big plastic bag. So really, this is all about organization and getting everything squared away and making sure that you have a place for everything and knowing where everything's going to go. You really want to be so anal about keeping everything as warm and as dry as possible. So once you've set up your tent, you've got your warm, dry clothing on, you've raised your body temperature a little bit, and now you're warm and comfortable, you're cooking your dinner. Now's a good time to take that warm clothing off, now that your body heat is nice and warm. Wring the clothing out, get as much moisture out as possible. Put the wet clothing on for an hour or 2, but I would really recommend this as a way to go ultra light and still be warm and comfortable the following day when it's cold in the morning. You don't want to be putting wet stuff on. So whilst you're sitting around a camp and cooking and relaxing, you can put that cold clothing on, and your body heat is going to help warm that up. There's really no other better way to do this. I've experimented with putting my socks on my hands and trying to dry them with my stove. Every time I've tried to dry my clothing either with a stove or with a campfire, they either end up really smoky and smelling really bad, or worst case scenario, you could burn holes in your equipment, and you don't want to do that. I think the safest and most logical thing is to put it on and let your body heat, re-warm and dry those pieces of clothing. If you're constantly chasing this comfort zone of putting warm, dry clothes on every day, eventually you're going to run out of clothes, and all you're going to have is wet clothes. So that's why I recommend separating them into those 2 groups. Group A, things you can accept that will get wet, and Group B, things that are unacceptable to get wet. So another mindset tip that I want to share with you is to know when to quit, because there's no use just pushing through miserable days, day after day of constantly being wet. Once you've learned these lessons, then I think most of the learning that you can take away from that trip has been learned. So if you don't want to continually hike in the rain for the rest of the trip, there's a certain point where you're going to have to change your plans, and that's okay. If it looks like it's going to be an absolutely miserable week, just consider changing your plans. Nothing is set in stone. and no one's going to judge you for changing your plans that you had set in place. Sometimes you just have to accept that it's going to be crappy weather, and if you came out here to enjoy yourself and you know that you're not going to enjoy yourself trudging around in the rain for 7 days, then it's okay to change your plans. This happened to Benji and I on this most recent trip. We spent 4 days just hiking through the rain constantly, and we were having to spend more and more time in refugios to be able to get dry and warm, and we really didn't want that. We wanted to be out spending time in our tents and being outside all of the time. So we decided to stop, recalibrate, and look at our options, and what that resulted in was 3 of the most valuable and enjoyable days of the whole trip. So Benji and I stopped, we got some internet, we looked at the weather patterns, we looked at several different maps, we looked at local radars, and we determined that if we went south, away from the higher reaches of the Dolomites and into some lower altitude areas, then we were going to experience much better weather and much more enjoyable hiking. So essentially we called it quits on walking up in the high mountains of the Dolomites. We'd done that for 4 days. A lot of the passes were covered in snow still, so it was just not possible for us to complete the plan that we had in place. So we sat down and we drew up a new plan. We took a train down to Bozeman, we got resupplied with lots of fresh food, got warm and dry in the sun, and then we continued walking on this beautiful ridge, which was one of the most amazing and memorable trips of the last couple of years. Sure, it wasn't high altitude, and sure, it wasn't what we had expected from this trip, but it ended up being a really beautiful couple of days because we just embraced what we needed to at that time. We got to learn a lot about the local culture, and being in those lower altitudes, there is a lot more people to interact with and a lot more to learn culturally, rather than just kind of pushing ourselves in the high mountains and not really getting to experience what it's like being a human in that particular area. It really was one of the most interesting hikes that I've had in the last few years, because there's been people living in this area for thousands of years, and there is a really rich culture of farming and living on the land, and a lot of these ancient kind of primal practices that were still being integrated. There was some spooky witchcraft stuff going on this ridge, and I was really happy to experience that because it was something completely new and certainly something that we didn't expect from this particular trip. So it's great to learn these lessons from challenging yourself and putting yourself in a position where nature is being a little bit ferocious and really challenging you, but at some point you're going to learn all of those lessons that need to be taught, and in which case it's okay to just take an easier option. There's no shame in turning around and changing your plans to what you really need and want in that moment. So if you need to, just enjoy some easier time in nature and choose a route where it's not going to be so much of a slog. Look at this shite. So this was my first major hike for the year. I had 4 days walking in pretty much torrential rain in one of the most beautiful areas of the Dolomites in the UNESCO World Heritage Area. We didn't get done what we had originally set out to do, but we did learn a lot of valuable lessons about how to look after ourselves in difficult environments and challenging conditions. And then we got to have 3 days of walking in the sunshine and embracing a trip that was a little bit more cultural and not so much about being up in the really high mountains. So if you'd like to learn from me and the things that I'm learning both in hiking, about my body, about life in general, and if you'd like to see the questions that I answer every single month on my newsletter, then I'll leave a link for that in the description, and you can actually click it here on this video if you want to sign up. Something else I shared in that newsletter is basically a list of all these 10 main points. So if you want like a swipe file that you can screenshot, so you've got these lessons front of mind, that could be really valuable for you. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. It's the #1 thing that you can do to indicate to YouTube that this is valuable content. You can also like the video, which will really help, and put in the comments something that you've learned from this video, or something that maybe you've learned from your own experience that could be valuable for our community. That's all for this one. I will see you in the summit.